This year, the Academy's Board of Governors has voted an honorary Academy Award to a man who many of us believe is our greatest living filmmaker, and all of us know is one of the few true visionaries ever to work in our medium. Akira Kurosawa has made 27 films in his 47 years as a director, among them such indisputable classics as Rashomon, Akira, Throne of Blood, Seven Samurai, and Ran.
Someone once asked Mr. Kurosawa if his movies have a common theme. His answer was that they ask a common question. Why can't people be happier together?
Why is Akira Kurosawa called a master filmmaker, one of the greats of all time? Can you tell me? Could you pause this video, speak to me as if we're having a conversation why you might think he is so great? I hope you could. I do hope so. I hope I could answer that question. But I can never pretend to know the real answer. I'm a fake expert, very much in the vein of Orson Welles.
The experts.
The so-called experts.
Experts are the new oracles.
Who are greatly pretentious.
They speak to us with the absolute authority of the computer.
Pretend to know something, what they only know very superficially.
And we bow down before them.
If you know cinema, have read at least one book about movies, and are aware of people like Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, George Lucas, then you will know of the love and praise for Kurosawa. He has his fans all throughout cinema. Ingmar Bergman said my film The Virgin Spring is a touristic, lousy imitation of Kurosawa. At that time, my admiration for the Japanese cinema was at its height. I was almost a samurai myself. Federico Fellini, Kurosawa is the greatest living example of all that an author of the cinema should be. Satyajit Ray, speaking about Rashomon, the effect of the film on me upon first seeing it in Calcutta in 1952 was electric. I saw it 3 times on consecutive days and wondered each time if there was another film anywhere which gave such sustained and dazzling proof of a director's command over every aspect of filmmaking. Werner Herzog, I have always wondered how Kurosawa made something as good as Rashomon. The equilibrium and flow are perfect, and he uses space in such a well-balanced way. It is one of the best films ever made. Andrei Tarkovsky chose Seven Samurai as one of his 10 favorite films. Those 2 movies are consistently ranked high in the annals of cinema, and I could have done an entire video just on how much Kurosawa has inspired. But why for all of this? Why him? Why these movies? Why? I don't know. All I can provide is my own fleeting, first impressionist answer based solely off what I can see and feel without studying such a filmography for decades like many others have done and will continue to do. I can't write a biography on the man, but I can look at each one of his films, or at least periods of his filmography, and talk about the feeling. That feeling you get after a great movie. Sometimes it's great movie after great movie after great movie. A feeling that will last years and define your mind. I wish I could read one of the many Kurosawa biographies out there, either by Stuart Galbraith IV or Donald Ricci, but limited information sourced from Wikipedia is all we got. This video will be a first in a series I'd like to call First Impressions, where we'll take a look at certain sects of cinema, singular classics, trilogies, franchises, filmographies, anything I haven't seen that perhaps should. We'll look at how these parts of cinema can make us feel, but purely from that first impressions basis. The detailed stuff will come later. After joining the photochemical laboratories, later becoming the studio Toho, Kurosawa took up screenwriting in 1941 as a stronger means of work in the Japanese film industry. In 1942, he bought and read Tsuneo Tomita's judo novel Sanshiro Sugata all on its publication day. Production in 1942 went as well as one could hope for, with Kurosawa later writing that he had the time of his life making this film, and it kind of shows. While the story is a rather predictable sports drama, an underdog slowly gets better in a violent sport, takes on an aging master, succeeds, the underdog falls in love, has a spectacular showdown with a ruthless enemy. Yeah, you've seen this film before. But the cinematic trademarks that would define Kurosawa's work are all here. Fluid camera movements, efficient editing in action sequences, and experimental editing in more emotional moments, playing with camera speeds and the composition of human endeavors against that of the untenable forces of nature. These are efforts that weren't being emphasized in Japanese cinema of the time, or at least not all within one movie. Today, Sanshiro Sagata suffers most from being a 1942 production, with all of that going on, and subject to ruthless studio edits. That cut footage is now lost. The quality is irrecoverably compromised, and the characters do feel weak and underdeveloped, but Sanshiro Sagata works best as a first step in the right direction, like watching Mean Streets or THX 1138. The Most Beautiful, his next film, is a solid extension of Kurosawa's growing abilities as a filmmaker, now playing with larger groups of characters and the dynamic frames that could be subsequently crafted. However, propaganda films rarely, if ever, hold up to modern scrutiny. The story about female factory workers suffering the demands of the time but banding together and helping one another to double productivity and serve their wonderful country, it doesn't really taste very well when watching it today. Kurosawa would come to conflicts and disagreements with his star Yoko Yaguchi, who was serving as champion of the demands of her fellow actors, and through this conflict between the two, they would actually fall in love and marry, and led to 39 years of marriage together, which is quite nice. There are still those moments of beautiful compositions, of changing seasons with characters' emotions, but the overtly propaganda story never jumps out as anything but a rallying cry for a people who would soon suffer a humiliating defeat and depressing post-war period. This also brings Sanshiro Sagata Part 2 and The Men Who Tread on the Tiger's Tail, both from 1945, to grinding halts. The war continued to burn through Japan's resources, resulting in tighter grips on industry and producing a weaker morale for filmmakers and storytellers. Sanshiro Sagata Part 2 is one of the first examples of a movie sequel with a numbered title rather than a new title using same characters, but it's also maybe the first example of a studio-mandated sequel that simply rehashes the first film and only exists to capitalize on previous success. The repetitive nature of the story, as well as an emphasis on the Japanese characters defeating the drunken and foolish Americans, and the snow-covered finale, while yes, on paper, is the kind of Kurosawa finale you can expect, humans against nature, it still looks and feels really cheap. It's an obvious soundstage, whereas the first film had an actual hayfield. It actually had real nature to play with. The Men Who Tread on the Tiger's Tail was also an exceedingly cheap affair. The script was written in a day, shot in a matter of weeks, and is barely an hour long for some reason. This is his first Jidaigeki film, or period piece, but it and Sanshiro Sagata Part 2 are really only remembered by cinephiles, and even Kurosawa himself, as his worst ventures. The emotional toll from World War II begins to be felt in 1946's No Regrets for Our Youth, a fleeting and far too long romantic melodrama set against the backdrop of a thinly veiled reference to the 1933 Takagawa incident, which is essentially a series of student protests against the Showa-supported suppression of left-leaning teachings, dubbed dismissively as Marxist. This choice of subject matter already shows Kurosawa's acceptance of those who opposed the Empire of Japan's pre-war regime, which led to an attempted conquest of Southeast Asia by means of bombing Pearl Harbor. And you know what, I am vastly unqualified to talk about this. Just kind of look up, why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor, as well as the Showa period and the Meiji Restoration. It's all connected. No Regrets for Our Youth is one of the only Kurosawa films to feature a female protagonist, played by Setsuko Hara, the future muse of fellow legendary Japanese filmmaker Yasujiro Ozu. Hara's soulful and sensitive performance is what drives the whole film to its optimistic finale, even if the romance falls flat and the whole thing just takes a bit too long to come together. Still, it has another man versus nature finale, which defines No Regrets for Our Youth as a solid part of the Kurosawa canon, and would make his final film before transitioning into One Wonderful Sunday, Drunken Angel, The Quiet Jewel, Stray Dog, and Scandal make up a distinctive period for Kurosawa's career, one of directly addressing the pain his countrymen and women were feeling in the wake of defeat. Whether it's the abandonment of the young workers, rampant disease plaguing both minds and souls of the people, rising crime stemming from rampant inflation brought on by a complete dissolution of the government, or the growing toxicity of tabloid journalism even in 1950, Kurosawa insists on opening up a conversation about the state of humanity in this time, and questions where his people have yet to go. In One Wonderful Sunday, the two young poor lovers who only meet that day are faced with the idea of just trying to have one good day that constantly slips through their already outreached grasp. They can't face much more of the pain and cold of the days to come, and they try desperately for happiness, seemingly in vain. In Drunken Angel, a cynical doctor must come to terms with his inherent desire to help those in need when the man on his door dying is a yakuza, a growing plague amongst post-war Japan. This movie was also the first of 16 films that Akira Kurosawa would make with the one, the only, one of the greatest actors ever, Toshiro Mifune. In The Quiet Jewel, it's a doctor contracting syphilis and facing the harsh decisions of rejecting his loved ones to spare them the pain of his slow and unavoidable demise, driving home how sickness can destroy anyone. Stray Dog takes a more genre-specific approach to the post-war world. This is a police thriller, and yeah, it's the first ever buddy cop film. A criminal steals a by-the-book rookie's pistol and commits murder with it, emphasizing the guilt of the rookie's mistakes and a growing sense of cynicism within him, while he's still learning from his rough edges partner, who is as cynical but does have an edge of he understands how the world really works. Scandal switches gears and takes a more critical look at the public's infatuation with gossip and rumors, which come at the expense of actual human emotion. Stray Dog comes out the strongest for me. One Wonderful Sunday is a Capra-esque afternoon stroll that only directly confronts the issues at hand with a sweeping fourth wall break coming kind of out of the blue, which insists on the audience lending a helping hand to the poor young lovers of Japan. Drunken Angel and The Quiet Jewel share similar problems, in that the conflicts inside the protagonists are captivating, but everything that happens around them strains reality or real connection. Scandal has that initial criticism of tabloid journalism to base itself on, but leans even harder than One Wonderful Sunday into the Capra influence of wistful optimism in the face of hard questions about the soul-crushing work one faces in a depressed world. It literally has a middle portion set during Christmas where a main character stumbles through the snow, yelling Merry Christmas at buildings after discovering a better purpose for life.
Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas, George! Merry Christmas, George!
As a filmmaker, Kurosawa makes this period feel mostly traditional. His camera movements only rarely explore spaces in that flowing way he broke out with. Only rarely is camera speed played with to emphasize emotion, or even the contrast of nature. These things are there, but they don't feel like they mean much. Stray Dog, again, is the one that stands out. Not only being a cleaner cut and more involving film, but it's also better filmed, performed, edited. It feels like a lost gem of the procedural genre, almost cannibalized by the influence of films like In the Heat of the Night, 48 Hours, and Lethal Weapon. Kurosawa lets his stories reflect the realities of the time, but inherently as a director he is better at creating the thrilling experience of finding a needle in a haystack. He was starting to become the director who would take genre fiction from around the world, spin it Japanese, and create wondrous art.
Golden years go, golden years.
Come on, Homer. Japan will be fun. You like Rashomon?
That's not how I remember it.
Rashomon is a classic for a reason. The revolutionary story of multiple perspectives contradicting one another in favor of the teller's narratives, the confronting images of the sun shining through the trees, it only seems to get hotter and hotter as it all goes on, Toshiro Mifune's incredible performance, the careful direction of actors and camera to emphasize those perspectives being portrayed. Or maybe it's the sudden baby, a deus ex infantitis, I don't know Latin. This is a wild and dark story of violence and morality, with each of our point of view characters being deeply flawed and their own stories reflecting as such. The craft on display, it's exemplary, compared not only to where Japanese cinema was at the time, but also to Kurosawa's career, up until this point mostly made of propaganda films and timely yet rather dry dramas. Stray Dog was for Kurosawa a slow, breathing exercise, preparing for the deep dive into a strange, challenging, unconventional world that began with Rashomon. It shows the clearest picture yet of his abilities as a storyteller, both visually and narratively. His nature composition here is the mightiest. The burning sun exposing the sins of all that are involved, cut intermittingly with the torrential downpour of guilty rain, ending with the promise and hope of the new day's sun. This was the breath of fresh air I needed at this point in my Kurosawa journey, signaling the promise of wonder ahead for this renewed, shining period. 1951's The Idiot and 1957's The Lower Depths, one a literary classic by Fyodor Dostoevsky, the other a famous Russian play by Maxim Gorky, both unique literary adaptations that showed off Kurosawa's growing love for Russian literature, are the awkward and blatant missteps in an otherwise unparalleled future run after Rashomon. They may be beloved by other critics and cinephiles, Kurosawa fans all, but The Idiot's truncated runtime and incomprehensible plot as a result of worse studio edits than Kurosawa had ever faced, cutting an original 4.5-hour runtime down to just 100 minutes, and now the 3-hour restored version being the best one available, it still leaves you empty and incomplete as a viewer. Intertitles were hastily put together in order to fix a broken narrative that never works and might not have ever worked, as the notoriously dense Russian storytelling translated into Japanese with their associated ways of complex communication is just skittles and fish. The Lower Depths fares worse because at least The Idiot was shot well. This movie is just so boring. A term I can hate using but feels quite applicable to this impenetrable and borderline annoying movie. It kind of just proves the law that play adaptations rarely, if ever, work on the screen. We can kind of forget about these two awkward films within this period because there are greater films to talk about. One in particular, the one that Kurosawa made after The Idiot, was Ikiru. This one kind of destroyed me. It's no secret what the culminative emotional moment of the whole film is, seen as it's on the DVD cover and all the posters and in all the books and magazines. This in no way undermines the emotional power one feels when faced with what this image of an old man swinging alone through the snowfall really means. Death is such a hard concept to grasp for humans. This film addresses that overwhelming grief, but only at first, as protagonist Kanji Watanabe comes to terms with his fate, and is eventually determined to help the lives of those around him who need help. Miscommunications and misinterpretations are abound, but the truth of Kanji's soul is laid bare in these final moments, when through all the crushing bureaucracy, something good has been made, something pure, something that someone can look upon, smile, and happily fade away into. That pure and wonderful happiness, something that Kurosawa hopes is still alive in humanity. And then we have Seven Samurai, arguably one of the best, if not the absolute greatest piece of international cinema, or at least the most influential, building the team, the poor fighting the oppressors, developing a brotherly bond in the heat of battle, one-by-one sacrifices as part of the horrors of war, and a bitter ending, acknowledging that those who give their lives for the greater good can just be made to suffer. It's their lot in life. A victory that is simply not theirs, and on to fight another day is the best ending they can hope for. You have seen this story before, whether it's in the 2 magnificent 7 films, maybe the basic premise of A Bug's Life, that 1 episode of The Clone Wars, that 1 episode of The Mandalorian. Hell, there's a scene where the character Kyuzo goes off to try and steal one of the enemy's muskets. That is borrowed from, quite heavily, by Mad Max Fury Road, and that's okay. It's good that this film has had such a lasting, indefinite impact on the world of cinema. The heavy 3-hour and 20-minute runtime can be felt when the whole first half is just set up for the battle to come, but what a setup it is. Before the 2-hour mark has passed, you begin to care about Kanbei, Shichiroji, Katsushiro, Heihachi, Gorobe, Kyuzo, and most notably, the foolish and temperamental Kikuchiyo, Toshiro Mifune once again. While some of the deaths can feel sudden, rather impersonal, it is when all has been won that the weight of their sacrifice is felt. This isn't the film where final words are spoken. Heroes die face down in mud, or they're shot suddenly without warning. Essays and books and entire films have been made for the sole purpose of dissecting and honoring the legacy of Seven Samurai. So just know that all of this love and praise and influence is for a damn good reason. I Live in Fear was the last post-war film that Kurosawa would make for another 36 years. It's a slow and methodical examination of what it is like to live in the shadow of the bomb and of the fear of another attack. The slow pace can border on tedium, and the decision to cast Toshiro Mifune as the elderly protagonist and not Takashi Shimura, both Kurosawa's main collaborators and the latter 15 years older than the former, is strange. I Live in Fear might be the hardest movie to talk about because I didn't really connect with it. Love it if you want, was not really for me. What was for me was Throne of Blood, even more so than Rashomon, Ikiru, and Seven Samurai. Throne of Blood is a samurai adaptation of Macbeth, starring Toshiro Mifune in his most crazy performance yet. It has a tight 100-minute runtime, and it features the greatest finale I think I have ever seen. Taking direct inspiration from the perplexing and incredible practices of No theatre, Kurosawa imbued his adaptation of Macbeth with all the ghosts, blood, fire, smoke, wind, and unending violence that must have been lurking within Shakespeare all along. This is atmospheric cinema defined, from his otherworldly chorus singing the story into place, careful camera movements around actors emphasizing the space, the unending emptiness around all of them, and with all the fog one could ever imagine filling those spaces with endless mystery. This is as close as Kurosawa ever came to making a horror film. Throne of Blood is an intense and thrilling piece of filmmaking, brimming with delicious darkness, yet still leaving one on a note of sadness when you do reflect on that unending cycle of violence hundreds of years on. It is a true masterpiece. The Hidden Fortress is perhaps most notable as having a major influence on at least two of the characters in Star Wars. The focus on two of the lowest characters on the social ladder, peasants who fight only for money or at least food, was the direct correlation for George Lucas when creating C-3PO and R2-D2. Hidden Fortress's story of these two lowlives being roped into a conflict of kingdoms by escorting a princess and her samurai bodyguard across enemy territory was a heavy inspiration on early drafts of Star Wars, and some of those plot elements are still remaining in George Lucas's film. On its own, The Hidden Fortress is a nice piece of adventurous fun, brought to glorious life by Kurosawa's first use of the widescreen aspect ratio, dubbed then as Toho Scope, and features another kick-ass Toshiro Mifune performance, solid action sequences, a strong female character played by Misa Urahara, who holds the movie's one emotional moment proud on her shoulders, and the ending is a sweet note of learning to understand the working classes on which empires can be cruelly built on the back of. It is relatively one of the most optimistic and enjoyable Kurosawa films, even though there's one scene that it's no. And speaking of not holding up well, The Bad Sleep Well, a thrilling, loose adaptation of Hamlet that speaks volumes about the destructive nature of revenge, particularly to those you want to love, until the ending comes along and single-handedly ruins everything. The Bad Sleep Well is the best example of a damn good movie that is let down by an ending that reeks of time constraints, budget constraints, studio edits, or last-minute rewrites, perhaps a combination of all four, perhaps something else, I don't know. But what I do know is that having all your important climactic action happen off-screen and the actual final shot is just a static shot of an office, that's not a good ending. Luckily, Yojimbo and its sequel Sanjuro both have wonderful endings. Personally, I may get some flack for this out there, but I preferred Sanjuro to Yojimbo. Yojimbo is the more respected classic, and it's clearly pulling from Western influences, adapting them into the world of a Japanese border town and the psychology of a Ronin with a cold heart slowly warming to the plight of the desperate, but the confusing narrative of weaving interpersonal relationships between those in the town and playing both sides for fools, it got a little much. Things move along nicely from there, however, and before you know it, there's a big bold finish for the ages that's over in a minute and you've lost none of the energy. Comparatively, Sanjuro focuses that energy into a tighter and deeper exploration of this Sanjuro guy, this nameless Ronin, and what he's really capable of. He's more in control of the situation and calls out the immaturity of the eager young samurai around him, insisting that his way is right, which of course they ignore and everything else goes wrong. But the difference between both films, and the thing that stuck with me, is the nemesis that Sanjuro faces. Both characters, Unosuke in Yojimbo and Hanbei in Sanjuro, are played by new Kurosawa favorite Tatsuya Nakadai. And while Unosuke poses a sensual and animalistic threat in the first film, it's the direct parallels made between Hanbei and Sanjuro, both former great warriors searching for a new purpose, that felt stronger in the sequel. Two sides of the same coin, linked together in a fight for order and stability in a region rife with chaos. Sanjuro ends up having the stronger heart, one that inadvertently humiliates Hanbei, leading to their duel, which is the level of greatness that you just can't imagine. Please watch this for yourself. I do not want to say anything more. In the same vein as the ending that makes you think deep about the events you've just witnessed, a common theme amongst the films of Kurosawa's golden period is high and low. A film that might have been an influence on Parasite in a few ways, no spoilers. This kidnapping, ransom, and eventual manhunt thriller isn't a flashy period piece Kurosawa was now famous for, Nor was it a slow and methodical drama about contemporary Japanese issues. It's the perfect combination of the two. It has the genre thrills of Stray Dog and Yojimbo mixed with the social drama of Ikiru and One Wonderful Sunday, which smartly focuses one half on the ransom negotiations and the second on the painstaking manhunt across Japan that never ceases to keep you on your toes. Once all is said and done, the case is closed, more questions still pervade your mind about the state of wealth inequality and class structures, and they do not go away. "1965's Redbeard was an exhausting experience for Kurosawa and his crew. The longest shoot of the director's career, longer even than the grueling 148 days for Seven Samurai. It was a successful film, regarded in Japan as a powerful story about compassion within the early days of medicine, but the strong working relationship between Kurosawa and Toshiro Mifune split. Most point to Mifune's frustrations at Kurosawa's ever-growing perfectionism, and the long production schedule, which required Mifune to keep the titular beard, resulted in the actor losing out on many important roles, sending him and his own production company into crippling debt. Their lives took different paths afterwards, never collaborating again. This really sucks because their last film is a 3-hour chore through mostly uninvolving story material, only occasionally livened up by engaging side stories and excellent cinematography. Had High and Low been their last film before a mutual split of partnership towards other realms, their lives could have been different. I can't say. Redbeard signaled a significant change for Kurosawa. A cycle, in his own words to critic Donald Ricci, had come to an end. The rest of the 60s were plagued by false starts and dead ends. His first colour film and first English language film was planned to be Runaway Train in 1966. Kurosawa's lack of writing, reading, or understanding English meant that the translation of his script took too long to meet production deadlines. The project was delayed, lost funding from American backers, then cancelled in 1968. It was revived almost 20 years later by Golden and Globus.
We were going down the toilet and I didn't know what I was going to do next.
Yeah, those guys! As a John Voight and Eric Roberts starrer that failed to find an audience. It was still well liked enough by critics, and it actually had uncredited script contributions from Hideo Oguni and Ryuzo Kokishima, co-writers on Ikiru, Seven Samurai, Throne of Blood, The Hidden Fortress, Yojimbo, and High and Low. Kurosawa had hired Oguni and Kikushima to work on the script for the Japanese part of the 20th Century Fox film Tora Tora Tora. Kurosawa was to direct these parts, but further budget cuts reduced their script to a finalized version dramatically different to their initial efforts, and Kurosawa's working methods as a director were called into question. Producers Daryl and Richard Zanuck went so far as to call in a neuropsychologist to examine Kurosawa, thinking he was mentally ill. A diagnosis of neurasthenia, or weak nerves, was cause for Kurosawa's firing in December of 1968. He worked on the script and pre-production for years and did not contribute to a foot of film. Disenfranchised with international efforts, Kurosawa joined forces with friends and fellow directors Keisuke Kinoshita, Masaki Kobayashi, and Kon Ichikawa for a new project. The result of this partnership, Dodes Kaden, was Kurosawa's first color film, and that is the best thing it has going for itself. Moving away from the dynamic editing and complex compositions that had defined the 50s and 60s for him, Kurosawa went to his background as a painter, for a bold and surreal palette of a production that reflected the strange world of a Japanese slum. The story is maybe one of Kurosawa's worst, as it focuses on separate characters barely connected to one another, all with their own disparate themes and issues that is just too much put together. Some stories, like the one of the beggar and his son living in a car and freezing to death whilst imagining their dream home, is dramatically vibrant and visually wonderful, but an uncle raping and impregnating his niece, wife-swapping drunkards, a husband to an adulterous wife who has to take care of all of her children that she's had with other men, All of this is far too much to bear. Dodes Kaden is an interesting experiment, but nowhere near as involving or focused as Kurosawa's previous films. All his attempts to keep going with filmmaking, complete indifference shown by the audiences in Japan and around the world, a near total rejection by his country's film industry, a bad taste left from trying to work in America, and declining health resulted in Akira Kurosawa attempting suicide on December 22nd, 1971. It was unsuccessful. His subsequent recovery was quick, but Kurosawa still retreated into domestic life, now almost certain that his days as a director were over.